Hey everybody, Dan here. I need to add a little bit of context for today's podcast. This podcast features Collin Hansen's book on Tim Keller. It was recorded a few weeks before Tim died in 2023. We decided to hold it for a little while before releasing it, but you may notice that we talk about Tim in the present tense at times. Of course, we believe he is still alive with the Lord, although he's not alive with us in this world.
Before 9/11, the quote-unquote enemy of America was the atheist. And then after 9/11, the enemy of America is the fervent believer in religion.
Hello, and welcome to Working with me, Dan Doriani, hosting a podcast where we explore faith, work, culture, and the way believers can make a difference in their corner of the world. Today, my guest is Collin Hansen, whom I've known for about 10 years by now. I'm getting to know him a little bit better lately. He considers himself and calls himself a journalist, even though he has an MDiv from the most esteemed seminary, TEDS. His focus in his reporting and his writing is evangelical and reform movements in the last 20 years or so, maybe a little bit more than that. He's written a well-respected book called Restless and Reformed. He's just published a biography of Tim Keller. He's also written books like Gospelbound, Faithful Endurance. He loves to work with other people. Some of his books have 2 authors, some have 10. And he's also, very importantly, the vice president for content, and he's editor-in-chief at the Gospel Coalition. Welcome to the program, Collin. Do you want to add anything to my little peroration on your excellencies?
Husband to Lauren, father to 3 children, 7, 4, and 1.
Outstanding. I'm glad to know that. Collin, you're a gifted writer, trained as a journalist, and your prose is very clear. I would say you're almost a page turner, and I mean that as a compliment, meaning, it's good content and very accessible. But let me just hit this thing first. Most of your books are multi-author. Why do you like to write in teams of people? Even the Keller biography, which you wrote, is definitely a team project, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you like to write in a partnership? Because solo sure seems easier than wrangling 2 or 10 theologians to get it right.
Yeah. I think, Dan, journalists tend to span the spectrum of introvert and extrovert. You got on some end, like Sarah Zylstra on our staff, senior writer at the Gospel Coalition. She just wants to talk to people all day, every day. So everything she wants to do is collaborative in that sense. And she and I co-authored the book Gospelbound. Then you got my history at Christianity Today. I remember most of the editors just like hanging out by themselves in their office, dark, things like that. So there's a wide range. I definitely tend to be on the extroverted side of things. I tend to like to work in teams. I like to lead teams, and I tend to have more ideas than I have time to execute on my own. So co-authoring works in multiple different ways. So it could be where a topic of, say, 10 authors, well, they're all looking at the same kind of issue, but in personal ways with personal stories. And so it gives you different perspectives on things. Sometimes I've been co-author. My old professor, John Woodbridge from Trinity, he and I co-authored a book. That was one of those cases where we co-authored a book. I did most of the work as the junior partner of that arrangement, but it was certainly his idea. Gospelbound, Sarah did a lot of the writing, but all the stories were generated through us together in an editor-writer relationship. So, but mainly it comes back to I like working with other people, and I have more ideas than I can pull off on my own.
Yeah, well, it's true to a lot of people who write books. Certainly I have about 5 books in my head that if I could only find the time, they would pour out. They would probably be poor, but they would pour out. So your biography of Keller, we're recording this right before it's released, but we'll release the podcast later. Probably the most influential public theologian of substance. Now, I'm not saying that he's the most influential theologian, but he's the most influential deep theologian. I mean, he has a PhD. A lot of influential theologians emphatically do not have a PhD. And he's a serious thinker, probably the most influential of our last 25 years. He likes to say, and that's essential to Gospel Coalition for which you work, that we want to lead from the center, the gospel.
From the center, the way I described Tim in the book actually came from a video that Tim had recorded with Tim Keller, with John Piper and Don Carson for the Gospel Coalition. And he was talking about his influences, and he said that our influences are often like rings on a tree. You start with the core and you just keep expanding with time and with maturity. Now, I've come to understand that's how Tim sees himself, but it's not actually how most of us see our influences. More often, Dan, I see in ministry that somebody will bounce from influence to influence. They have phases. Now, Tim had phases where he would go all in on Whitefield or all in on Lloyd Jones or something like that, but he would always synthesize and build them. But especially I see younger ministers, they'll get fixated with John Piper, then they can't stand John Piper, they go on to N.T. Wright, then they can't stand N.T. Wright, they jump to something else. But Tim's a rings on a tree guy, and that core was a conversion through the proclamation of the gospel through InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. And the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship of the post-war period, we're talking Packer, Stott, Lloyd Jones, Stacy Woods, that group there. And so from everything he's ever done, it's all flowed from that center. And that's what I think has allowed him to be tethered to something that he can be this public theologian, he can be this cultural critic, he can do all these different things, but it's always bringing it back to Jesus. It's not engaging these things in just some sort of abstract academic matter. And I think bottom line, he's also a preacher and he's an evangelist, which most academics are neither preachers nor evangelists. So when you understand Tim in that sense, at one point, I think the best way I could think to describe him was as an ecclesial revivalist, a church-based revivalist. And so for him and for the Gospel Coalition, it's always about that transforming gospel.
Let me accentuate your point just for a moment about rings in a tree versus jumping around. The most interesting insult I read in a long time was the accusation that John Wesley was agglutinative. And I will confess I had to look the word up, and it basically means gluing, comes from glue, gluing things together that should not be glued together. So, he would, if you read Wesley, he's hard to follow. He's not systematic at all, but it's largely because he's Anglican 1 minute, Lutheran another minute, Holiness another minute. And he doesn't seem to have cared to tease out the tensions between these views. And Wesley's a great man and a great mind, but radically not systematic.
Right.
And so that's another way to say it. That we want to have a core, a center, and then we operate toward the periphery from our core. So there's a statement that is kind of a blend of what you said in one place and what Keller says that I want to just ask you to comment on. So in Keller's mind, and yours and mine for that matter as well, Reformed leadership fractured in the 18th century when Jonathan Edwards died. Edwards joined theological orthodoxy and experiential revivalism. He was an active evangelist. He was an ecclesial evangelist. And cultural apologetics in the sense that he was engaging in Enlightenment philosophy. And if you read his works in light of what was happening in the world this time, it's clear who he's engaging with. So he was all three. And then when he died, it split. And we have in the revivalist side, Finney, who couldn't have cared less about theology. And we have Princeton, was very theological, but not very culture engaging. And then we have the Northeast, Jonathan Edwards Jr., culture engaging and theologically drifting slowly toward, semi-Calvinism and beyond there. That seemed like a prominent point in your book. Why is it important? What lessons do we have to learn from it today?
It's a prominent point in my book because normally when we tell history, it tends to have the shade of reflecting our own personality. And so it's really Tim's self-understanding as he talks about it through history. And that's part of what makes Tim unique. When you read his books, what you see is a clear triperspectival presentation. You see the situation, the normative, the existential. And that's one reason why, most writers don't work in all those realms. Some of them can engage the mind in terms of ideas. Some of them can engage the heart. Some of them can, just talk about systematic theology. But not many people can do all three. So really, it's an understanding of how Tim looks at the world, and it's how he understands himself as well. And it started to click with me that as I looked back through history, there was a common thread to all these different figures that he looked up to. And they all tended to be, I mean, you could really start with Augustine, but you can jump through to Calvin. You go from Calvin to Edwards. You can go from Edwards then to Herman Bavinck. And he identified the same trends in all of them, that all of them were engaged on the cutting edges of cultural transformation in some way. They were theologically orthodox and deep, but at the same time, they had a keen sense on the necessity of experience in religion. And so, I mean, usually when we tell those stories, we're telling something about ourselves. And Tim's also using that. He's borrowing that language from Mark Knoll, who borrowed it from George Marsden, and a reflection on Reformed denominations. And Tim has famously used that language to describe his own, which you're familiar, Presbyterian Church in America, and how there tend to be different camps. And I would say it's not so much that everybody is like in one camp. It seems to be that people tend to straddle two camps. So I would push back on Tim a little bit and say that I think he's being reductionistic about the Princeton theologians. I think they were very engaged in cultural apologetics. They just weren't doing it the same way that he does. And they were doing it from more of an evidentialist perspective than a presuppositional one. And so that's part of where he differs from them. They also had a little bit more of a kind of an anti-cultural bent than an engaging bent. Sometimes I think Charles Hodge has a little bit more of that bent, but then you see Warfield's writing on evolution come out later. So that's why I think it's important in the book, and it's important in TGC's history, because the first time Tim talked about this, to my knowledge, was the first meeting that then became the Gospel Coalition. And I think that fingerprint is all over the different realms. And one quick point on this, Tim's colleague, contemporary at Westminster Seminary, Sinclair Ferguson. And I think you can clearly see that with Sinclair and Tim, they overlap in one of the categories of the pietism, that part, the experiential part. The Puritans have that overlap. Sinclair's more on the doctrinalist side, confessional side, and then Tim's more on the transformationalist, culturally engaging side. And so I think when you see that they can overlap in one of the areas where they have at least two, you can see a pretty fruitful relationship, even if they don't share all three in common. But it's where you get a setting where each person is characterized by one and not the other two, where you have a lot of fracturing in movements.
Right. Yeah. I'll just label this for the sake of our listeners for a second. So you are praising people who are attentive to the norm, the law, the standard theological, the situation. Yeah. That is to say, what's going on in our culture and so forth, and the existential, what's going on in our heart.
In our hearts.
And we see that in pastor theologians often. So the people you cited as forebears, Augustine, of course, was a theologian and very much a pastor.
Very much.
And Calvin we think he was a theologian, but he was very much a pastor.
Pastor again.
Preached 4 or 5 times every week for years and years. Augustine similarly. Bavinck also was a pastor. And was pastorally minded as well as deeply culturally engaging. And we would probably say that all of them were really good listeners. Augustine maybe listened to critique in order to critique a little bit more, but the story of Bavinck, his constant interaction with friends with whom he radically disagreed.
On the opposite side.
As far apart as you could possibly get. And he, would submit his books to them and just stay engaged with them. So I'm just saying that a different way for the sake of our listeners who might not be as steeped in the historical factors that you know inside and out. In other words, I'm trying to be your popularizer, Collin.
Translate for me there.
Yeah. So let's just talk about what we see today. I mean, obviously we have similarities and lessons to be learned from all this, or else there'd be no point in writing a book and having this conversation. We do see more and more Reformed theology, and a certain branch of evangelicalism is much more doctrinally astute and interested than, say, 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah.
We also have an enormous interest in cultural apologetics. I heard you give a talk, which you said that's kind of the issue of the day. And we have to make sure, you didn't quite put it this way in your talk, but we have to make sure that we don't lose ecclesiology gaining rise and we don't lose evangelism.
Right.
So that's what you said, but, say it your way and why. I mean, I'll give you 2 chances. Say that your way, number one, or say why it's so essential to Gospel Coalition, to which you've given so much of your adult life.
Yeah, so the essential aspect of the Gospel Coalition that comes together is a bringing together of basically biblical exposition, especially against the backdrop of biblical theology, okay? And then combined with an effort to then, from that gospel, flows outward application to all aspects of life. These are all very distinctly Reformed perspectives in there. So you go back to the biblical theology in there, and that's a lot of the influence of your Hardest Voss and the Australians and all that kind of stuff. And then that flows then, sometimes it's in contrast to systematic theology, but so that's biblical theology. But then it's against the backdrop of biblical exposition. You're going an overview of the Bible, but you're also attending to the details in there. We have to attend to those details, so that aspect of exposition. But then, through the Reformed perspective, we are then also, we're applying it to all of life. We're looking to say this is not merely a personal thing, but it transforms churches, it transforms neighborhoods, it transforms our vocations, which is why we're having this podcast. It sends us forth. These are all distinctives of the Reformed tradition. And so bringing those things together was core to the Gospel Coalition. And then I think what also makes it unique is the situatedness. When you look at the original founding documents that TGC put together, it was not intended to merely be for all times and all places.
Right.
It was an effort to articulate the particular challenges of our time and place when it came to anything from hermeneutics, how we interpret the Bible, all the way to epistemology, how we understand truth. There's a lot of that in there. And so I think many Reformed movements have put a high emphasis on theology and teaching the Scriptures. I think a lot of Reformed movements put emphasis on transforming culture. Not as many Reformed movements have showed that they are linking necessarily to each other.
Right.
And that goes back to your earlier question about bringing those different realms together. So I would never say that what we do in cultural apologetics is necessarily the most important, or certainly not the only thing that we do, but it's one of the distinguishing marks of what we do, as opposed to some other Reformed ministries who assume, I think, a little bit more of a transcultural assumption to their confessions.
Yeah, so you and I both know that if Gospel Coalition is going to be criticized for anything, it'll be criticized most likely for being too culture engaging. We spend too much time over there.
Yeah.
And I'll be honest with you, when I was preparing this little discussion we're having and reading a bit and meditating, I thought, I wonder what would be revealed if I gathered all the blogs I wrote for Gospel Coalition and other organizations. Would I be guilty of the mistake that Carson, for example, points out, and that is, when you start devoting too much energy to secondary issues, no matter how important they are, no matter how, people are wildly popular. I remember a few years ago, I wrote an article for Gospel Coalition on transgender, and I said, I gave this little talk, and 300 people asked for, a copy of it. And you said, well, of course, because that's what people want.
Number one search term on our site.
People aren't screaming for more articles on justification versus sanctification. As important as that is,
right?
Maybe they feel they have it nailed, but it is vital. You say, Carson says, Keller says, I say, we agree to address these issues from the gospel core.
Right.
Why do we lose that? I know I kind of answered it right now, but why do we lose that? How do we keep from losing? Maybe that's more important.
One of the things that that critique has been a common one for a long time, and a couple different examples of why that tends to happen is that a lot of times the people who are saying we're not biblical or theologically focused enough, it's actually because they're more interested in the other stuff too. They just don't like what we have to say about the cultural and political issues.
Oh, now don't get defensive on me, Collin.
I'm not getting defensive. And the other thing is that the algorithm often knows us better than we know ourselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes the algorithm feeds us what we are looking for and what other people are looking for, as opposed to what we say that we want. It's kind of feeding us candy corn instead of the broccoli that we say that we need to be eating in there. So at some certain level, if you did a deep dive on our site, you'd actually see a vast majority of that content would be Bible and theology related, but it's just not as popular.
Right. Yeah.
It's there. The other thing is that we don't try to replace the church.
Right.
And this is what our pastors are doing and laboring with their hours of their day and their studies is to open the scriptures. So we're not kind of operating a parallel sermon producing ministry. We're trying to fill in the gaps with a lot of that stuff. But it still comes back to the basic critique that you said, which is that, I mean, if I'm not talking about the Gospel Coalition in isolation, we are prone to the same temptations. But if I'm talking about evangelicals in general, yeah, I see a lot of interest right now in public theology issues and culture transformation and politics from especially the right now, but also the left, and a lot less interest in talking about the gospel.
Well, another way to put it is, can I just say?
Yeah, go for it. Do it.
Another way to say it is, when we don't like your position on public policy, you're a transformationist. When we argue our position, we're just trying to do what's right.
Well, it's amazing how the spirituality of the church is wielded selectively.
Yes, right. No, that's absolutely correct. But we agree that it's again, this is a Carson comment that you single out in one of your pieces. It's easy to sound prophetic from the margins.
Yeah.
We need to sound prophetic and be prophetic from the center, by which we don't mean the center politically or theologically. We mean the center, meaning the core of our life is the work of Christ on the cross, his death and resurrection applied to us by the Holy Spirit, lived out by our union with Christ, empowered by community, teachers, friends, loved ones, and behind all that, of course, and before all that, the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, what Don Carson said to me was, when we brought together these pastors to form TGC, we wanted men who the thing that got them out of the bed each morning was the gospel.
Right.
I thought that's a beautiful thing to say, and there are many, many, many ways that we can all be deceived. And I think one of Carson's famous comments, the first generation believes, the second generation assumes,
right? The
third generation forgets, and then that's the revival cycle. You have to come back then and get back to that core. I think and now we can see that and how that happens. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is to stay focused on that gospel when all of your friends who are kind of card-carrying conservatives, whether that be theologically or politically, say that with their mouth, but don't show it with their actual lives and their interest. There is to keep insisting on the gospel in season and out of season.
Right.
That's maybe a temptation that this generation has forgotten that has befallen many other generations before ours.
Hi, I'm John Perkins, Executive Director of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. You've been listening to our podcast, Working with Dan Doriani. The Center also offers conferences on faith and work throughout the United States. Our goal is to equip formal and informal leaders to make a difference in their corner of the world. We equip Christian leaders to run 10-hour faith and work cohorts on 3 continents. Please visit our website at faithandworkstl.org to see how your church or organization can form a faith and work cohort for people who have, or aspire to, a leadership role in their workplace. Now, back to Dan.
So I'm going to play Greek scholar for a second. In season, out of season is literally kairos, akairos, when it's timely, when it's untimely.
Yeah.
So when you got to be ready to
Beautiful.
speak the gospel when nobody wants to hear it at this particular moment. Oh, yeah, we know. Let's move on to what counts. Somebody or other said in front of me, it might have been, we could take a guess as to who it was. I'm not sure who it was. But my goal is that when somebody cuts me, I will bleed the gospel. And, you want that to be true, but sometimes when we're cut, we bleed our take on the social issue of the day. And it's for good motives. You want to help people who are wrestling with questions like, where do we find our identity? But you better answer that from the core once again, or the center.
I think, Dan, there's a vocational aspect to this. I think it's tempting for pastors to lose confidence in the transforming power of the gospel because they see so many examples where it seems to fail or at least to use the biblical farming language, agricultural imagery. You plant the seed and it doesn't always grow. It doesn't seem to get watered, and or it gets choked out, or any number of things there. So I think there's a temptation for pastors vocationally, other church leaders, to say, I can see much more immediate results as a community activist. I've seen that on the left. And then I can get a lot more results as a political partisan. I see that quite a bit on the right. I can just see something much more tangible and immediate. Again, I think that's a vocational challenge for pastors who are engaged in work that is often hidden and often slow and often thwarted.
Yeah, so I'm preaching every week right now. I'm an interim pastor for a year, maybe two, at a wonderful church. And I would call it not a challenge, but a hazard.
Yeah.
And and a temptation. So I just had this experience again. You don't preach all that much, but you're preachy sometimes. You get kind of close to it. I had a conversation yet again with a pastor today in which we talked about a time when recently we both thought we had terrible sermons. Like, this is the worst sermon of the fall season. I'm ready to preach a total disaster of a sermon. And then, of course, 4 people come up to us and say, this was exactly what I needed to hear. And then they tell you what they needed to hear. And it was
nothing that you said.
Well, no, it was what I said, but it wasn't my main point.
Yeah.
In my mind, it was an explanation leading to the main point. But now that I think about it, it was actually the main point. It was the main point. It was working from the gospel, but I didn't realize it because I'd, slipped a little bit or fallen into the hazard of relevancy. So, Tim Keller, go back to Tim Keller for a minute, unless you want to talk about that for a minute.
Let's do it.
Okay. I'm going to do this in just like a minute or two. Yeah. We'll talk about 2 things. We'll talk about his influences, and also we'll talk about the role of 9/11 and Rodney Stark's amazing book, The Rise of Christianity. Just tell us one thing, give us an appetite for the book about an influence on Keller that we should let influence us as well. Just, if a chunk of the book is about influences.
I go in a lot of different directions on that. We've already talked about the cultural apologetics quite a bit. I would go back to Barbara Boyd. Barbara was first female staff member at InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, post-war period. And what I loved, it basically just taught inductive Bible study to college students.
Yep.
And the basics of the foundation of Tim's ministry was the basic inductive principles of observation from the text. And the simplicity of saying, take a look at this text for 2 minutes, write down all your observations. And 2 minutes, you're like, oh man, there's a lot. I got a lot here. And then she'd say, now go back and do it for 30 minutes. Thinking, what in the world am I going to do with this? And all of a sudden, for 30 minutes, it's like, how did I miss all this?
Right.
First. So just basic stuff like that. I think that whatever else you might want to say about Tim's influence, that's the basic. If he wasn't effective at being able to exposit and understand the actual text, nothing else would matter. Wouldn't be moving to us. So that's the basic.
Yeah, and scientists stare at the text of nature.
Yeah.
I don't know how to pronounce it, but I say it. Agassiz, who had his students famously stare at a fish, and then stare at a fish some more, and then stare at a fish some more.
Yeah.
If a fish is worth it, the Bible is certainly worth it, right?
That's a good way to put it.
And he's famous for encouraging that. 9/11 was a very big catalyst for him as a writer and made him much more of a public theologian than he was before that. Partly, very much because he addressed the issues very well and very biblically. But can you tell, I love the book, Rise of Christianity by Stark. How on earth, why did you cite that? Why is that an important book?
So again, what I'm focusing on in this biography is the influences on Tim. It's a little bit of a different approach. And so I didn't necessarily want to know everything he said. I do talk about his 9/16/2001 sermon, but I wanted to talk about what were the things he was discussing leading up to that, and what were the sources that he returned to and the members of the church returned to in this cataclysm of 9/11. And the clear example was Stark's work, and especially his work on the urban nature of Christianity, and specifically the challenges that they faced during the plagues. And so the idea was that the church grew even for some simple biological reasons,
Right.
but also in spiritual and conversion ways because they stayed during the plagues. Their people survived because of the care they were given, and they cared for their neighbors. Their neighbors came to know Jesus. And
Can I just interject really quickly?
Yeah, go for it.
The death rates were 25 to 35%
Right.
overall for those
Yeah.
plagues. So this is not like a 2% chance of dying.
no.
It's a very real chance of dying.
Massive.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
massive. We don't know exactly what they were back
Nobody
then.
knows. Right.
Yeah, exactly. So it could have been a number of things. And so what people kept telling me about 9/11 was that Redeemer played a crucial role, not just in a small sense of growing to 5,000 people, adding 1,000 people overnight, but was a key institution in holding the city together and encouraging people not to flee the city.
Right.
And so I just wanted to understand, where did that come from? It was a lot of the work that Tim had been doing on urban, on historical movements of urban Christians, and especially under Stark's sociological historical reflections in the 1990s.
Yeah, and he's a great thinker and a great historian, which I recommend as very fervently.
Yeah.
I'm going to do one more big question. I'm going to go to lightning round, okay?
Okay, do it.
One more big question is, you notice what many people noticed, and Tim labeled very well, that before 9/11, the apologetic challenge was all religions are equally true.
Yeah.
Afterward, all fervent religions are conservative or deeply held or radically held religions are equally toxic or dangerous or false or destructive to society. So that the new atheists move from, I don't believe in Christianity, you got to prove it to me, to Christopher Hitchens, whom I happened to know before he died. Although it was a little bit of a shtick, I have to say.
Yeah.
In person, he was much more amenable to Christians, but it's dangerous. It ruins everything.
Right.
Just say a word or two about that shift. Do you think Tim got it right? Is that
I
accurate?
think he did. So I was trying to understand, what was it about 9/11, what happened in there? And actually, it turned out I went back over my interviews this last week, and I think he hadn't quite seen the connection between his apologetics and the success of Reason for God, mainly because it's what he'd been teaching for decades. But
It's
it found the
familiar
right
to him by
it's
now.
familiar to him,
Yeah, right.
but it hit a new audience because it was one of the most effective Christian responses to the new atheists. And so what Tim said to me that I'd never heard from anyone before is that before 9/11, the quote-unquote enemy of America was the atheist.
Right.
The
Communism
communist.
especially.
Exactly. And then
Right.
after 9/11, the enemy of America is the fervent believer in religion. And it didn't matter. Religious people are dangerous. And I just had never thought about that the same way. And Tim has been very clear in saying that despite the fact that nearly 30% of Manhattan was claiming no religion when he went there in 1989, which, by the way, is about the same rate as the national rate now in the United States, he said, nevertheless, preaching now and post 9/11 and now kind of a postmodern or post-postmodern or whatever we're in right now is way harder. There's been a significant continuing evolutionary turn. So even the situation the last 20 years has changed quite a bit. But very clearly there was a strong transformation in terms of just how people conceived of religion in general, as you mentioned before, as it poisoning everything. And it didn't matter what religion.
Yeah. I find, just to say personally, and then I'll go to lightning round, that when I discuss atheism today, I have to approach it from the perspective of plausibility, not nonsense or danger.
Yeah.
So some of you are attracted, even in church, to this, and there's a reason why you are, but it's not the solution. That's kind of the approach I feel compelled to take when I think about the actual unbelievers and atheists and agnostics I know that might be in the building.
Right.
All right, lightning round.
Let's do it.
Ready?
Yeah.
What have your children... You have to answer all these in 60 seconds or less.
I'll do
All
my
right, there's a
best.
gong that's going to go off. Books are going to drop on your head from the ceiling. We've figured it out in advance. What has your child or your children taught you most recently?
That we belong to God and not to our parents. They are their own human beings, made in the image of God, known by God before the foundations of the world. They are not just a chip off the old block. They are their own personalities, their own aspirations, and even at their young age, just their their own futures. And so I think I sensed at some level that I kind of like, they were mine, and then they don't feel that way, like I clearly have the role of shaping them, but they just teach me that God, I mean, we all are known to God and belong to God and not to anyone else.
So I did a study of the pronouns for this some years ago, and I found that children are described as belonging to themselves, to God, and to their parents, all three. Statistically, it's pretty similar in the Bible. That's just a thought, but I appreciate it. That's what
I mean. At some level, of course, I am responsible for them.
Yeah.
But you just, as a parent, you just assume they're going to be a reflection of you. They're a reflection of God and their own personalities, and then also you.
Yeah, right.
Ultimately, you have to entrust them to the Lord. He gave them
sure
to
do.
you, and they belong to Him.
That's for sure. Oliver O'Donovan said it beautifully. He said, "Children are begotten, not made." We don't make babies, even if people say that. Okay, number 2, putting aside all practical considerations, what would you devote yourself to for 1 year? You can do it in any place. You can do anything. Take your kids. You'd have a nanny. What would you like to do for 1 year?
I'm a history and culture guy, and I care a lot about family history. And so I'd do a historical trip through the eras across Europe. My background is a pan-European, to put it mildly, and I would just enjoy, and my family would as well. They would enjoy just learning. Beautiful thing about Europe is that you can get so many different aspects of history across the eras.
Right.
There aren't that many parts of the United States where you can do that.
That's true.
Virginia would be one. Boston would be another in some ways, though Virginia has more eras that are interesting to me, at least. But
but not Indianapolis so much. Yeah.
Indianapolis or Birmingham.
Yeah, right.
We got a couple eras that are interesting, but
that's right.
Not much beyond that.
Question number 3. What would you like to be celebrating 5 years from now?
I'd like to be celebrating 5 years
from now. It doesn't have to
be
personal. It could be personal or communal.
Well, I'm going to stick on theme with this. I could talk about a lot of different stuff, but I want it to be normative in the church, to be thinking about culture from a much deeper perspective. James Davison Hunter said it to me years ago. He was kind of mocking me in the answer, but I was asking about politics. He said, I'm not a weatherman. I'm a climatologist. Above all, we need Christians who love God and love His Word. That's what we need. But we also need them, I would hope, to be thinking much deeper, because the changes that we're undergoing right now are down here. They're at the climatology level. They're not on the weather level. They're not like, look outside. They're affecting us.
We're looking at 20-year trends is what we mean.
Yeah. I mean, we need more of what Carl Trueman, Chris Watkin, we need a lot more of what those guys are doing. I want to celebrate that is just the norm. So we just talk in those terms. I had a friend just pull aside, and he brought a lecture from his church, and it was clearly derivative from Truman. And I thought, that's what we need to be normative, because we got to think on that level.
Yeah, that's great. Collin, it's been great to have you. I always enjoy talking to you, and now other people get to hear you conversationally.
Yeah, that's
so fun. Thank you so much. Thanks for the work you do at Gospel Coalition, for the books you write, for the talks you give, and for giving us almost an hour of your time.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Working with Dan Doriani is a production of the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. We seek to promote faithfulness in the workplace, in education, in discipleship, and in the stories of believers who've applied their faith at work. If you want to put your faith to work and change your corner of the world, visit our website, the Center for Faith and Work St. Louis. Look for faithandworkstl.org. That's one word. We'll help you start a cohort with like-minded believers who also want to practice their faith at work. This podcast is donor-supported. To keep us going, please donate on our website. Maybe more importantly, you can support us by listening, by subscribing, by sharing, by liking us, by posting us on your favorite platform, or go old school and tell a friend.